"You're like a brother to me," she said for years. So I introduced her to my new girlfriend. Now she's the one begging for a crumb of my attention, and I just call her Sis. The phone buzzed on my nightstand, shattering the quiet. The screen glowed with her name, Miranda. It was 11:37 p.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been up since 5 for a client presentation that had nearly broken me, and the sweet embrace of sleep was finally pulling me under. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again, insistent, relentless. A perfect metaphor for the last 3 years of my life. With a sigh that felt like it came from my bones, I swiped accept. "Miranda, everything okay?" The response was a wet, hiccuping sob. "Nolan," she choked out. He ghosted me. Zane. After 4 dates, I thought he was different." I closed my eyes, the familiar script unfolding. I was the understudy who'd played this role so many times I could do it in my sleep. The same tale I'd heard with Bradley, with Kevin, with the guy from her yoga studio who'd borrowed $60 for emergency gas money and vanished the next week. Only the names changed. "Hey, slow down, breathe, tell me what happened." The story tumbled out in fractured pieces. A cryptic text about needing creative space. An unread message sitting there for 3 days like a digital tombstone. A profile that had suddenly vanished from the app, taking with it the $80 she'd lent him for new guitar strings just yesterday. "I'm such an idiot," she wailed. "He said he needed them for a recording session. I thought I was investing in his art." "You're not an idiot, he's a coward," I recited, my voice on autopilot. I pushed myself up, my body screaming in protest after 14 hours hunched over campaign mock-ups. "Do you want me to come over?" "Would you?" Her voice was small, pathetic. "I have Ben and Jerry's." 20 minutes later, I was on her couch watching her demolish a pint of cookie dough while she dissected every text, every possible meaning behind Zane's sudden disappearance. I nodded in the right places, making sympathetic noises. This was my function. I was a high-end appliance. Nolan, the emotional support human. "I should have seen it coming," she said, scraping the bottom of the container. When he asked for the money, there was this look in his eyes, like he was calculating something. I wanted to say I'd warned her. 3 days ago, when she'd shown me his messages asking for the loan, I'd felt that familiar knot in my stomach. The same knot I'd felt with Bradley's temporary car payment request, with Kevin's just until payday grocery money. But I'd learned long ago that Miranda didn't want warnings. She wanted validation for decisions she'd already made. "You're generous," I said instead. "That's not a flaw." When the tears finally subsided and the ice cream was gone, she looked at me, her big blue eyes still shimmering with the remnants of her latest romantic catastrophe. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You're my rock. Seriously, like the brother I never had." There it was. The word landed not with a sharp sting, but with a dull, sickening thud that seemed to echo through my chest. Brother? I'd heard it before, of course, dozens of times over 3 years. But tonight, after the exhaustion, after the sheer déjà vu of watching her fall for the same type of guy with the same red flags, it felt different. It wasn't just a word, it was a life sentence. It was her neatly, finally nailing me into a box I would never be allowed to leave. I just smiled, a tight, thin line that felt like it might crack my face. "Anytime, Miranda." As I walked out into the cool night air, fumbling for my car keys with hands that felt disconnected from my body, the camera in my mind finally panned back. I saw the last 3 years not as a slow-burn romance waiting to bloom, but as a montage of servitude. Me driving across town at 2 a.m. to fix her flat tire in the rain. Me listening for hours as she cried over men who treated her like a convenience store, there when they needed something, forgotten when they didn't. Me remembering her birthday, her mother's medication schedule, the anniversary of her father's death that she'd mentioned once in passing 2 years ago. While she routinely forgot whether I took my coffee black or with sugar, whether I preferred Italian or Mexican food, whether my middle name was James or John. I was the foundation of her life. All right, the part that was buried underground, unseen, expected to bear the weight of everything she built above without ever cracking, without ever shifting, without ever asking for anything in return except the privilege of holding it all up. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and the low hum of late-night radio. When I finally collapsed into my own bed, Still wearing the clothes I'd thrown on to rescue her from another predictable disaster, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time she'd asked me about my day, about my work, about anything that mattered to me. I couldn't. The Patterson Industries presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning. I'd been working on it for weeks, crafting an integrated social media campaign that would position their new sustainable packaging line as the industry standard. It was the kind of account that could define careers, the kind of win that separated senior account managers from the pack. I should have been excited. Instead, I felt like I was moving through water, every action requiring twice the normal effort. Miranda's late-night crisis had cost me 3 hours of sleep I couldn't afford to lose, and the caffeine wasn't quite managing to bridge the gap between exhaustion and functionality. But when I walked into the boardroom and saw the Patterson executives leaning forward in their chairs, when I watched their faces light up as I walked them through the campaign timeline, when the CMO actually said, "This is exactly what we've been looking for," something shifted. For 45 minutes, I wasn't anyone's emotional support system. I was just Nolan Davies, account manager, presenting work I was genuinely proud of. "Brilliant work, Davies," Henderson said as we filed out of the conference room. "I'll have HR process your promotion paperwork today. Corner office, full account ownership, and we're talking about an $8,000 salary bump." $8,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was validation, proof that somewhere, in some corner of the world, my value was recognized and rewarded. The company mixer 3 weeks later was supposed to be a celebration, not just for landing Patterson Industries, but for what it represented, proof that I could build something meaningful when I wasn't constantly putting out fires in someone else's emotional landscape. The promotion had come with more than just money. It came with respect from colleagues who'd watched me grind for 3 years, recognition that felt like sunlight after a long winter. Our friends Curtis and Holly had insisted on taking me out to celebrate. Curtis worked in our IT department, and Holly was a nurse practitioner at the Children's Hospital downtown. They were one of those couples who'd figured out the secret to making partnership look effortless, probably because they'd never confused emotional labor with love. "So walk us through the campaign," Curtis said as we settled into our booth at Murphy's Tap. "Start to finish." I found myself lighting up as I explained the integrated approach, how we'd position Patterson's sustainable packaging, not just as environmentally responsible, but as the premium choice that forward-thinking companies were already demanding. How we'd created content that spoke to both B2B buyers and end consumers, bridging that gap that most campaigns never even attempted. "The CMO said it was exactly what they'd been looking for," I said, taking a long pull of my beer. Apparently, they'd been through 4 other agencies in the past year. "That's huge, man," Curtis said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You've been grinding for that kind of account." Henderson finally seeing what we all knew was there. Holly nodded enthusiastically. "It's about time someone recognized how much you put into—" "Oh my God, you guys, look at this one." Miranda's voice cut through our conversation like a fire alarm. She'd arrived 20 minutes late, as usual, and had been scrolling through her phone since she sat down. Now she thrust the screen across the table with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered fire. The screen showed a brooding guy in a black beanie holding a vintage guitar. His profile read Zane, with some pretentious quote about art being the only truth worth pursuing. "His name is Zane. He's a musician," she breathed, as if she were announcing the discovery of a new continent. "His bio says he's looking for a muse. Can you even?" Holly gave a non-committal smile. The kind nurse is perfect for dealing with difficult patients. "Interesting, right?" Miranda beamed, completely oblivious to the conversation she'd just derailed. The conversation about my career milestone that we'd specifically planned around. "It's so refreshing, not like the boring corporate types who just talk about quarterly reports and client meetings all night." She patted my arm with the casual dismissiveness of someone shooing away a persistent fly. "No offense, Nolan." The condescension was a physical blow that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over our table. Curtis studied his napkin with the intensity of an art critic. Holly took a sudden interest in the bar's vintage beer sign collection. I felt heat creep up my neck, that familiar burn of humiliation mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. I wasn't just her friend in this moment. I was her benchmark for boring, a stable, reliable landmark she used to navigate toward more exciting disasters. The guy she kept around to make her feel better about her choices by comparison. None taken, I managed, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Miranda was already back to her phone, probably crafting some witty opening message to Zane, the tortured artist. I think I'm going to ask him about his songwriting process. Artists love talking about their process. I just nodded and took another drink of my beer, watching the golden liquid swirl in the glass, while the victory of my promotion turned to ash in my mouth. The Patterson campaign, Henderson's praise, the corner office with actual windows. It all felt suddenly small and insignificant compared to the gravitational pull of whatever mysterious quality Zane possessed that I would apparently never have. 2 days later, I decided I had to try. Just once. I couldn't live with the what if that would probably haunt me for the next decade if I didn't at least attempt to change the narrative between us. I asked her to meet me at The Grind, the coffee shop where we'd spent hundreds of Saturday mornings over the past 3 years. It was neutral territory, familiar enough that she wouldn't suspect anything unusual, intimate enough that we could have the kind of conversation I'd been rehearsing in my head for 48 hours. She arrived 15 minutes late, buzzing with the kind of manic energy that usually meant a new romantic obsession had taken root. Her cheeks were flushed, and she couldn't sit still, checking her phone every few seconds with the nervous excitement of someone expecting important news. "So Zane and I have been texting nonstop," she announced before she'd even fully settled into her chair. "He writes his own songs, Nolan, original compositions. He sent me a voice note of one last night. It was so raw, so honest. He's got this incredible falsetto that just cuts right through you." I stirred my black coffee with mechanical precision, gathering courage, like collecting coins from a wishing well. Each breath felt deliberate, each heartbeat loud enough to hear over the ambient noise of espresso machines and casual conversation. "Miranda, we need to talk about us." Her smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes. A subtle recalibration, like someone adjusting the focus on a camera lens. "What about us? When you say I'm like a brother, it hurts." I kept my voice low, controlled, the way Henderson had taught me to deliver difficult news to clients. "We spend all our time together. I'm your first call for everything, good or bad. I feel like we're a couple in everything but name." Her smile finally faded, replaced by a look of patronizing patience that I'd seen her use with overeager bartenders and persistent salespeople. She sighed with the weariness of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. "Nolan, what we have is special. It's pure. It's not complicated by all that messy relationship stuff that ruins everything." She leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering profound wisdom. "I love you, but I'm not in love with you. With Zane, I feel a spark, this electric connection. With you, I feel safe." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a funeral pyre. Safe. It was the nicest way anyone had ever called me insignificant. "So I'm the safety net," I stated, my voice flat as pavement. "You're my foundation," she corrected, her tone implying it was a grand compliment that I should be grateful to receive. "There's a difference. You're the solid ground that lets me build everything else on top." And in that moment, sitting in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and broken dreams, I saw it all with terrifying clarity. She wasn't confused about her feelings. She wasn't scared of ruining our friendship. She knew exactly what she was doing, had probably always known. She would happily let me spend the rest of my life holding her up while she danced on my shoulders, searching for a spark that would never, ever be me. I was a utility, a comfortable piece of furniture that served its purpose without complaint. The brother she never had, which was just another way of saying the man she'd never want. The confusion and aching hope that had lived in my chest for 3 years suddenly evaporated like morning fog. It was replaced by something cold and clean and absolutely certain. I nodded slowly, processing this revelation with the same methodical precision I'd used to analyze the Patterson campaign metrics. I stood up, pulling a $10 bill from my wallet and placing it on the table next to my barely touched $3 coffee. "Okay," I said, my voice eerily calm, like the eye of a hurricane. "I understand now. Hope you find what you're looking for, Miranda." I turned and walked out of the grind without looking back. I heard a faint, confused "Nolan" behind me, but it sounded like it was coming from another planet. The door swung shut with a soft chime, cutting off the sound of her world, and for the first time in 3 years, I could only hear my own. The first week was the strangest. It wasn't the silence that was deafening. It was the absence of the constant low-grade hum of her chaos. No sudden dramatic texts pulling me away from work presentations. No panic calls about forgotten phone chargers or cryptic messages from men she just met. No emergency ice cream runs at midnight. The peace was unnerving at first, like the ringing in your ears that only becomes noticeable when everything else goes quiet. I kept reaching for my phone, expecting the familiar buzz of crisis, only to find nothing but work emails and spam. I didn't announce my departure from Miranda's orbit. I didn't write a long, cathartic letter explaining my decision or send a dramatic text about needing space. I simply enacted what I came to think of as a digital secession. I went into my phone and with calm, methodical precision, that felt almost surgical. I muted her notifications across every platform. I didn't block her entirely. That felt too dramatic. Too much like the kind of gesture she'd probably screenshot and share with her other emotional support friends. I just stepped back, created distance, gave myself permission to exist in the spaces between her crises. Her first attempts to breach the void came exactly as I'd expected. "Nolan, are you mad at me? This is so immature. We're adults. Talk to me." I read the notification on my watch before it faded into digital oblivion. I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, not even the satisfaction I'd imagined might come with finally setting boundaries. It was like hearing a weather alert for a storm in a country I'd permanently emigrated from. With the mental real estate Miranda had occupied suddenly vacant, I found myself with an abundance of time and energy that felt almost foreign. I poured it into work, not as an escape mechanism, but as genuine focus. The Patterson account was performing even better than projected, and Henderson had started including me in strategy meetings with senior leadership. "Davies, your approach to integrated campaigns is exactly what this industry needs," he'd said just yesterday, reviewing our quarterly numbers. "We're seeing engagement rates 30% higher than industry standard." My colleagues began treating me differently too. Jessica from Creative started asking for my input on visual concepts. Marcus from Analytics would grab coffee with me to bounce around data interpretation ideas. I realized I'd been so focused on being Miranda's emotional support system that I'd never really invested in being anyone else's professional peer. I started going to the gym, not to burn off frustration, but to build something for myself. The honesty of iron was refreshing. It yielded results directly proportional to the effort I invested. No hidden agendas, no emotional manipulation, no mixed signals. Just cause and effect in its purest form. It was 8 weeks into my new life when I met Janet. I was in the business section of Powell's books, looking for a book on data visualization techniques that Marcus had recommended. The Patterson campaign had sparked my interest in understanding how numbers could tell stories, and I was exploring ways to make client presentations more compelling. "Good choice," a voice said next to me. "But if you're just getting into analytics, this one gives a better foundation in statistical thinking." I turned to see a woman with intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses and a smile that seemed genuinely curious rather than performative. She held out a different book, Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer Knaflick. "Thanks," I said, taking it and reading the back cover. "I'm trying to expand my skill set. Marketing's becoming more data-driven every year." "Smart move," she replied. "I'm a data analyst at a fintech startup downtown. We see a lot of marketing. Campaigns that could be twice as effective if they actually understood what their numbers were telling them." Her name was Janet. She had a master's in applied mathematics from Portland State and spoke about statistical significance the way most people discuss the weather, casually, but with underlying expertise that made you want to listen more carefully. We talked for 25 minutes right there in the aisle about Python programming and predictive modeling, about the difference between correlation and causation, about why most A/B testing was fundamentally flawed. It was a conversation, genuine back and forth, where both people contributed something valuable. She asked me questions about marketing attribution models and actually listened to my answers, following up with insights that showed she'd been processing what I'd said. I asked about her work optimizing fraud detection algorithms and found myself genuinely interested in problems I'd never considered before. There was no performance happening. I wasn't trying to be her emotional support system or her crisis management consultant. She wasn't treating me like a convenient sounding board for relationship drama. We were just two professionals sharing expertise and discovering unexpected common ground. The simplicity of it felt revolutionary. We went for coffee the following Saturday, then dinner the next weekend. Janet suggested a Vietnamese place in the Pearl District that I'd never heard of, where the PHO came in, bowls the size of mixing basins, and the conversation flowed as easily as the beer. She told me about her work developing machine learning models to detect credit card fraud in real time. I found myself genuinely fascinated by the challenge of staying ahead of criminals who adapted faster than most businesses could pivot. When she talked about a particularly frustrating stakeholder who kept demanding impossible timelines, I offered perspective from my own experience managing client expectations. But I didn't try to fix her problem or take responsibility for her stress. She didn't need rescuing. She needed a partner to bounce ideas off of, someone who understood the unique pressures of trying to do good work in an imperfect system. It was a revelation, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared problem solving, rather than one-way emotional labor. Over the following months, we developed an easy rhythm. Weekend hikes in Forest Park, where she'd identify birds while I tested new photography techniques I'd started exploring. Cooking together at my apartment, my clean, peaceful apartment that no longer had a dedicated drawer for someone else's emergency supplies. She introduced me to her friends from grad school, intelligent people who asked thoughtful questions, and remembered my answers the next time we met. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something rather than constantly repairing what someone else kept breaking. Curtis and Holly noticed the change. Immediately. "You seem different," Holly said one evening, when the four of us were trying a new brew pub downtown. "More present, more like yourself." "Miranda drama finally over?" Curtis asked with the bluntness that made him a good friend and an excellent IT troubleshooter. "Something like that," I said, taking a long pull of my IPA. I realized I hadn't thought about Miranda in days. The space she'd occupied in my mental bandwidth had been completely repurposed. Janet fit seamlessly into our friend group in a way Miranda never had. She contributed to conversations rather than hijacking them. She showed genuine interest in Holly's work at the Children's Hospital and laughed at Curtis's terrible programmer jokes with what seemed like authentic amusement rather than polite obligation. "I like her," Holly told me quietly when Janet and Curtis were debating the merits of different craft beer styles. "She's good for you, good with you." The difference was subtle but important. Miranda had been something that happened to me. Janet was someone I was building something with. 12 months into our relationship, as we were planning a weekend trip to the Oregon coast, I started thinking seriously about the future in a way I hadn't since college. Janet had mentioned wanting to see the tide pools at Haystack Rock, and as I researched restaurants and hiking trails, I found myself imagining not just this weekend, but many weekends, many shared discoveries, many quiet moments of partnership. The confrontation with Miranda happened, as these things often do, in the most mundane of settings. The cereal aisle of Whole Foods on a sleepy Sunday morning. I was comparing protein content in granola options, debating between brands while Janet was across the store, selecting vegetables for the week's meal prep, when a voice behind me shattered the domestic tranquility. "Nolan?" I turned slowly, my body recognizing the voice before my mind fully processed it. Miranda stood 3 feet away, looking like a ghost of her former self. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that hadn't been styled in days. She wore no makeup, and the vibrant, performative energy she'd always carried was gone, replaced by something raw and desperate. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Miranda," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I placed the box of granola in my cart and waited. "Please." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of months of accumulated regret. "Just talk to me for 5 minutes. I made a huge mistake. The biggest mistake of my life." The words began tumbling out in a rushed, rehearsed torrent that sounded like she'd been practicing in mirrors and empty rooms. I was scared of what we had because it was so real, so solid. I thought I needed excitement, drama, that stupid spark. But Zane was exactly what you said he'd be. He took the $80 for guitar strings and spent it on drinks for some other girl he met at an open mic night. Posted pictures of them together on his Instagram story the same night he stopped responding to my texts. She paused, chest heaving, tears welling in her eyes like water behind a failing dam. What I felt for you, it wasn't brotherly. I was lying to myself, lying to you. I was an idiot. I love you, Nolan. I've always loved you. She was laying her soul bare in aisle 7, expecting me to catch it and cradle it and tell her everything would be okay, the way I always had before. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked. I didn't see the girl I'd pined for 3 years, or the friend whose crises had once felt like emergencies. I saw a stranger who was causing a scene in the grocery store, someone whose emotional chaos no longer had any connection to my peace of mind. I felt a distant, academic sort of pity for her pain, the same way I'd feel watching a character in a sad movie. But it was no longer my responsibility to fix or soothe or manage. I appreciate you saying that, Miranda, I said, my tone even and genuine. I really do. A flicker of hope ignited in her wet eyes, probably mistaking my kindness for an opening. So what does that mean? Can we please just go get coffee and talk? Please, just talk? I shook my head gently, offering a sad but final smile. I'm really happy with Janet. We're building something good together. But I'm glad we can finally be the friends you always said we were. I paused, letting the full weight of the reversal settle between us like sediment in still water. Hope you find what you're looking for. I watched her face completely shatter. Hope, pride, the very architecture of her assumptions about us collapsing in real time. She stood there speechless while I pushed my cart forward, the wheels rolling smoothly on polished linoleum toward a life that no longer required her approval or participation. Janet was waiting by the organic produce, examining avocados with scientific precision. Find something good? She asked, glancing at my granola selection. Perfect choice, I said, meaning more than just the cereal. Ready to head home? As we walked to the checkout together, I felt the final piece of my old life click into place behind us. The foundation Miranda had built on was solid now, but it was supporting something entirely different, something I'd chosen to build rather than something that had happened to me. Sometimes the strongest foundations are the ones that learn to say no,